Imagine a hero who saves you, but their eyes. They hold a secret far deeper than you could ever imagine. What if the man who pulled you from the brink wasn't just a rescuer, but something more, something ancient and powerful, lurking beneath the surface? Prepare for a revelation that will shatter everything you thought you knew about destiny. Chapter 1. The Weight of Normalcy. The antiseptic smell was the first thing that greeted Alice. Always. It clung to the back of her throat, a clean, sharp scent that promised order. Control. She smoothed the front of her pale blue scrubs, the fabric worn soft from 100 washes. Another 12-hour shift done. Another night of beeping machines, quiet suffering, and her own carefully constructed peace. She was a good nurse, methodical, gentle. She could soothe a crying child or hold the hand of a dying man without letting the chaos touch the fragile walls she'd built inside herself. Her feet ached, a deep, persistent throb that radiated up from her heels and settled in her lower back. It was a familiar pain, a grounding one. It meant she was tired. It meant she was human. A small, satisfied smile touched her lips as she pushed through the double doors of the emergency ward and into the hushed quiet of the late-night hallway. The hospital hummed around her, a living thing with veins of wires and a steady, rhythmic breath. This was her sanctuary, a place where instincts were buried under procedure and wildness was tamed by science. "You look beat, Alice," Maria, one of the night shift orderlies, said, leaning against a gurney. Her voice was a low rumble, kind and weary. Alice offered another tired smile. "Just the usual. Feels like a full moon out there tonight." The words slipped out before she could stop them, a relic of a language she'd tried to forget. Her breath caught. For a moment, she saw her mother's face, pale with a fear she'd never understood, whispering those same words by a packed suitcase. "A full moon is coming, Alice. We have to go." She pushed the memory away. Hard. It was just an expression, that's all. People said it all the time. It didn't mean anything. The ER was just hectic. You know how it is? Maria nodded, her eyes knowing. "Yeah. Well, get home safe. A storm's brewing. Radio said it's going to be a bad one." The thought of the drive home made the ache in her bones feel heavier. Her little sedan wasn't exactly built for bad weather. Still, the thought of her small apartment, of a hot shower and the lumpy comfort of her bed, was a powerful lure. It was a life she had chosen. A quiet, lonely, normal life. It had to be enough. It was all she would ever let herself have because she knew what happened when you wanted more. Bonds weren't a blessing. They were a curse that broke people, that shattered families and sent them running in the dead of night. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. Stepping outside, the air was thick and heavy, charged with a strange energy that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. The wind was already picking up, whipping a loose strand of her brown hair across her face. It smelled of rain and wet earth, a wild, heady scent that tugged at something deep inside her, something she kept locked away. She ignored it, just as she always did. She fumbled for her keys, the metal cool against her skin, and hurried toward the dull silver of her car in the mostly empty parking lot. Overhead, the sky was a bruised purple and the clouds churned like a troubled sea. It was more than a storm. It felt like a warning. Chapter 2. The Crash. The rain didn't fall. It attacked. A solid sheet of water slammed against her windshield, and the wipers fought a losing battle, their frantic squeak, squeak, squeak a protest against the deluge. Alice leaned forward, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, trying to see the road ahead. Headlights from an oncoming truck blinded her for a second. A brilliant, terrifying white light. She flinched, turning the wheel just a little too sharply to the right. That was her first mistake. The tires lost their grip on the slick asphalt. A sickening slide. The world became a dizzying spin of green and black. Trees. Night. The car lurched, and for a heart-stopping moment, she was weightless. Then came the impact, a sound like a giant fist crushing a tin can. Metal screamed. Glass exploded inward, a shower of tiny, glittering diamonds in the sudden, jarring darkness. Her head snapped back against the headrest. Pain. Sharp and hot, it flared across her shoulder and down her side. The world went silent, except for the frantic drumming of the rain on the crumpled roof and the drip, drip, drip of something wet near her ear. She tasted copper. Blood. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her heart. The driver's side door was crushed against her, pinning her leg. She couldn't move. I'm trapped. The thought was a scream in her mind. Smoke, thick and acrid, began to fill the small space. Oh God, it's going to catch fire. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the storm. The crunch of boots on wet gravel and broken glass. A shape appeared at the passenger side window, a massive silhouette against the distant, flashing lights of the city. A man. He didn't hesitate. He didn't call for help. He simply put his hands on the frame of her car door. Alice's mind, foggy with pain, struggled to understand what she was seeing. With a groan of protesting metal, he pulled. The door, bent and twisted in the crash, ripped away from the car as if it were made of cardboard. He tossed it aside with a clang. He leaned into the car, and the wild scent of the storm rushed in with him. Rain and pine and something else. Something musky and powerful that made her dizzy. In the dim light, she could see a strong jaw covered in dark stubble, broad shoulders that filled the entire space. And his eyes, they seemed to glow. Are you hurt? His voice was a low growl, deeper than the thunder that rumbled outside. My leg, she stammered, her teeth chattering. It stuck. He barely seemed to look. He reached across her, his arm brushing hers. A jolt, like a raw bolt of electricity, shot through her entire body. It was so intense, so overwhelming, that she gasped. Her skin tingled where he'd touched her, a sudden, shocking heat that had nothing to do with her injuries. He placed a hand on the dashboard and another on the mangled doorframe beside her. He braced himself, and he pushed. The entire frame of the car groaned and shifted. The pressure on her leg vanished. She was free. He moved with an impossible speed, unbuckling her seatbelt and gathering her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. He cradled her against a chest that felt as solid as a rock wall. His warmth soaked through her thin scrubs, chasing away the cold shock. She felt a strange sense of safety, a feeling so foreign and yet so right. As he carried her away from the smoking wreck, her head fell back against his shoulder. Her vision swam, but just before the darkness took her, she saw his eyes again. For a fleeting instant, caught in the flash of distant lightning, they weren't just glowing. They were a brilliant, burning gold. Chapter 3, Whispers and Shadows. Waking up was a slow, fuzzy climb out of a deep, dreamless pit. The first thing she registered was the familiar, sterile scent of a hospital. But this time, it felt wrong. Alien. Because she wasn't the one walking the halls. She was the one lying in the bed. A dull ache throbbed in her shoulder, and her leg felt stiff, but a quick mental check told her nothing was broken. A bad sprain, a few cracked ribs, a concussion. She was lucky. Incredibly, impossibly lucky. The doctor had said so himself. He'd also said he had no idea who to thank for pulling her from the car. The mysterious hero was gone by the time the ambulance arrived. For the next 2 days, Alice drifted in and out of a medicated haze. In her dreams, she wasn't in a hospital bed. She was running, barefoot through a damp forest, with moonlight silvering the leaves of the trees above. A feeling of power, of pure, unbridled joy surged through her limbs. She felt strong, she felt free. She felt a presence running beside her. A large, dark shape of shadow and muscle. She could smell the scent of pine and wild earth. She wasn't afraid. She felt a connection, a deep, silent understanding. And then she would wake up, her heart pounding, the sterile white of the hospital room feeling like a cage. The whispers started on the 3rd day. Nurses on her floor would stop by, their voices hushed with a mix of awe and curiosity. "We heard what happened, Alice. You're so lucky someone was there. They said he tore the door right off the car. Can you believe that?" "What did he look like? Did you see his face?" She would just shake her head, offering a weak smile. It was all a blur. It was so dark. It was a lie. She could see his face perfectly every time she closed her eyes. She could feel the jolt of his touch, see the impossible flash of gold in his eyes. But she couldn't speak about it, because explaining it would mean admitting it was real. And if it was real, her carefully controlled world was a lie. Finally, they released her. Her arm was in a sling, and she walked with a slight limp, but she was whole. Her apartment felt strangely empty when she returned. The silence was louder than the constant hum of the hospital. She stood in the middle of her living room, feeling like a stranger in her own life. The crash had changed something. It had shaken the foundations of her reality, and now, cracks were starting to show. That night, she couldn't sleep. The dream of the forest came back, more vivid than ever. She could almost feel the phantom ache of muscles she hadn't used in years. A week later, still on medical leave, she decided to take a walk. The late afternoon sun was warm on her skin, and the quiet suburban streets of her neighborhood were peaceful, but she felt restless, watched. A shiver traced its way down her spine. She told herself it was just paranoia, a side effect of the trauma. As she rounded a corner, she saw him. He was standing across the street near the edge of the small wooded park that bordered the neighborhood. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, his hands in the pockets of a worn leather jacket, watching the street. It was him, the man from the crash. She knew it instantly. The broad shoulders, the dark hair, the sheer, intimidating presence of him. A cold dread washed over her. He wasn't just a random stranger who had saved her. He was here, in her neighborhood. A few of her neighbors hurried past him, giving him a wide berth, their heads down. They were afraid of him. He was a known entity, a shadow everyone saw but no one spoke to. The feared, silent guardian who watched over their quiet little corner of the world, and as he slowly turned his head, his gaze met hers from across the street. There was no mistaking it. Even from this distance, she could see the unmistakable, impossible gleam of gold in his eyes. He hadn't just saved her. He had been waiting for her. Chapter 4. The Scent of Danger Avoidance. It became Alice's new routine. She left for her morning walk 10 minutes earlier. She took the long way to the grocery store, circling 3 extra blocks just to stay off the street that bordered the wooded park. She kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the cracks in the sidewalk. But she could still feel him. It was a strange, prickling sensation on the back of her neck, a hum of awareness that told her he was out there, watching. The silent guardian with the impossible golden eyes. She told herself she was being foolish, that the trauma of the accident had made her paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It coiled in her gut, a constant, low-level hum of anxiety. Tonight, the feeling was different. Sharper. The air, usually calm and smelling of cut grass and distant car exhaust, was tainted with something else. Something foul. It was a scent that made her stomach clench, a rank, metallic odor that reminded her of a butcher shop left open too long in the sun. She picked up her pace, her keys clutched in her fist, the metal teeth biting into her palm. Her apartment building was just ahead, a beacon of light and safety. Almost there. They came out of the alley between 2 houses, 2 of them. Their movements were too quick, too fluid to be normal. They didn't run. They flowed out of the shadows like spilled ink. One was tall and gaunt, with greasy hair and a hungry look in his eyes. The other was shorter, more powerfully built, with a cruel twist to his lips. They spread out, blocking her path. "Look what we have here," the tall one sneered, his voice a rasp. A little stray, all alone in the dark. Alice's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't a normal mugging. Their eyes. They held the same feral light she'd seen in her dreams, but twisted with a sick, predatory glee. The foul scent was coming from them. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice shaking but firm. The shorter one laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She's got a little fire in her. I like that." He took a step forward, and then something inside Alice shifted. The fear was still there, a cold knot of ice in her stomach. But something else rose to meet it. A hot, furious rage. A growl vibrated deep in her chest, a sound she had never made before, a sound that felt both alien and completely natural. Her senses sharpened. She could see the cracked leather of the man's jacket, smell the stale sweat coming off him, hear the too-fast beat of his heart. Her own wolf, the part of her she had starved and denied for a decade, was clawing its way to the surface. Before they could take another step, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness across the street. It moved with a silent, terrifying grace. It was Damien. He didn't run or shout. He was simply there. One moment he was across the street, the next he was standing between her and the two men, his back to her. He was a wall of solid muscle and pure menace. "She's not for you," Damien said, and his voice was not the low growl she remembered. It was the sound of rocks grinding together, a promise of violence that made the air crackle. The two men hesitated, their bravado faltering. "This ain't your territory, Black Moon," the tall one hissed, the name sounding like a curse. "Anything I want is my territory," Damien replied, his voice dangerously soft. "And I want you gone." The shorter man lunged. It was a blur of motion, but Damien was faster. He moved with a brutal efficiency that was breathtaking to watch. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the man went down with a choked scream. The tall one's eyes widened in terror. He turned to run, but Damien was on him in a heartbeat, slamming him against the brick wall of the alley. Damien leaned in close, his body a coiled spring of lethal power. Then he was gone, and the man slid to the ground, unconscious. It was over in seconds. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of Alice's ragged breathing. Damien turned back to her. His chest was heaving slightly, and in the dim streetlight, she could see his eyes. They were blazing, pure, molten gold. He took a step toward her, his gaze sweeping over her, checking for injuries. The fury in his expression softened into something else. Something fierce, protective, and achingly familiar. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was that same electric jolt, a current that seemed to arc straight to her soul. He leaned in, his face just inches from hers, and his lips parted. A single guttural word escaped, a whisper so low she wasn't sure if she heard it or felt it resonate in her bones. "Mine." Chapter 5. A Past Unburied. He didn't take her to her apartment. He didn't explain. He simply took her by the arm, gently but with a firmness that allowed no argument, and led her to a sleek black truck parked in the shadows. The drive was silent, the tension in the cab so thick Alice could barely breathe. He took her out of the city, deep into the woods that surrounded the town, down a gravel road she never knew existed. He stopped in front of a small, isolated cabin. It was simple, made of dark wood, with a single light glowing in the window. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice small. "Somewhere safe," he answered, his voice still rough from the fight. He got out and came around to her side, opening the door for her. It was a strangely courteous gesture that felt completely at odds with the raw power she had just witnessed. The inside was sparse but clean. A fireplace, a simple kitchen, a worn leather sofa. It smelled of wood smoke and him. He gestured for her to sit, then went to the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water, his movements economical and precise. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing against hers. That jolt again. It made her flinch. He sat in the chair opposite her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He watched her, his golden eyes intense, patient. "You have questions." It wasn't a question. Alice swallowed, her throat dry. What were those men? What are you?" "They were rogues," he said, the word dripping with disgust. Shifters without a pack, scavengers. They hunt on the edges of territories looking for the weak. Shifters. The word hung in the air between them, the forbidden word from her childhood, the truth she had run from her entire life. Like werewolves? She whispered, the word feeling like ash in her mouth. He gave a single, sharp nod. I am the alpha of the Black Moon Pack. My name is Damien. He said it simply, a statement of fact, like telling her the sky was blue. An alpha. A pack leader. The world she had escaped was crashing back down on her. The name of his pack snagged in her memory. Black Moon. A cold dread, colder than the fear from the alley, washed over her. Black Moon, she repeated slowly. My parents, they used to talk about Black Moon. Damien's expression tightened. A flicker of something, recognition, pity, crossed his features. What were their names? Elias and Lena Sinclair, she said, her voice trembling. The moment the names left her lips, she knew. She saw it in the sudden, hard set of his jaw. She saw it in the way his golden eyes darkened with a history she didn't understand. They were members of this pack, Damien confirmed, his voice low. They were exiled over a decade ago. The air rushed out of Alice's lungs. Exiled. Not a sudden move for a new job. Not a family emergency. A banishment. Her entire childhood, the hurried packing, the fear in her mother's eyes, the shame that had clung to their family like a shroud. It was all a lie. They had been cast out, by his people. The anger that had simmered in the alley came roaring back, hot and blinding. It was a fury born of betrayal. Your pack did that to them? To my family? She shot to her feet, the glass of water falling from her numb fingers and shattering on the floor. You're the reason my life was ruined? She turned and ran for the door, driven by a desperate, instinctual need to escape, to get away from him, from this cabin, from the truth that was suffocating her. She fumbled with the handle, her hands shaking too badly to work the latch. Before she could get it open, his hand slammed against the door just beside her head, the wood groaning in protest. He blocked her path, his body caging her in. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. She could smell the pine and the wild musk and the barely controlled power. You can't run, Alice, he growled, his voice a low, commanding rumble that vibrated through the very wood of the door. Not from this. Not from me. Chapter 6. The Weight of Prophecy Trapped. Her back was pressed against the unyielding wood of the door, Damien's body a formidable cage in front of her. His scent filled her senses, overwhelming her, making it hard to think. The raw, animalistic power coming off him was terrifying, yet a traitorous part of her, the part she kept buried, felt a strange, terrifying pull toward it. She pushed against his chest, her hands flat against the hard muscle. It was like shoving against a granite wall. He didn't even flinch. Let me go, she demanded, her voice tight with a mixture of fury and fear. I can't, he said, and for the first time, she heard something other than command in his voice. A rough, pained edge. It's not safe for you out there. The rogues smelled you. They know what you are even if you don't. More will come. What I am, she scoffed, a bitter, broken sound. I'm a nurse. I live in a small apartment. I am nothing like you. Your blood doesn't lie, he countered, his golden gaze burning into hers. You are the daughter of Elias and Lena. You are one of us. His eyes softened for a fraction of a second. You are my mate. The word hit her like a physical blow. Mate. The ultimate bond. The fated connection that shifters supposedly lived for. To Alice, it was the ultimate curse. It was the reason her parents had lost everything. It was the chain she had sworn she would never wear. No, she breathed, shaking her head. No. I refuse. A flicker of raw hurt crossed his face before his expression hardened again into an unreadable mask of control. "It's not a choice, Alice. For either of us." He took a step back, giving her space, but the intensity of his presence remained. "Your parents weren't exiled just for breaking a minor pack law. Their crime was much greater. They tried to run from a prophecy." Alice stared at him, her mind reeling. Prophecy. Mates. Alphas. This was a nightmare. What prophecy? An old one. One our pack has been watching for a very long time. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of deep frustration. "It speaks of a daughter born to exiles, a lost wolf who would one day return to the pack." He paused, and his eyes locked onto hers, pinning her in place. "It says she would be the Alpha's fated mate." Her blood ran cold. This was about more than just her parents. This was about her. About him. "What else does it say?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She needed to know. She had to understand the shape of the cage that was closing around her. Damien hesitated, his jaw tight. He looked as if the words themselves were a physical weight he did not want to speak. "It says," he began, his voice dropping to a low, somber tone, "her bond shall bring the Alpha to his knees, his power undone by her heart's decree." His power undone, brought to his knees. The words echoed in the silent cabin, each one a nail in the coffin of her denial. It wasn't a love story. It was a death sentence, or worse. A curse that would strip this powerful, formidable man of everything he was. Her bond, her very existence as his mate, was destined to destroy him. All the fear, all the anger, all the desperate need to be normal, coalesced into a single sharp point of resolve. This was a fate she would not accept. For his sake, as much as her own. She lifted her chin, her eyes meeting his without flinching. The shaking had stopped, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "I will never accept you," she said, her voice clear and steady, the words a vow. "I reject you. I reject this bond. I reject all of it." Chapter 7, The Alpha's Gaze. Her prison was beautiful. That was the cruelest part. Damien had installed her in a room in the main pack lodge, a massive structure of dark timber and river stone that overlooked a sprawling, misty valley. The window was large, with no bars, but she knew she was no less a captive. Every time she stepped out of her room, a dozen pairs of eyes would follow her. The Black Moon Pack members watched her with a tense, unnerving mixture of fear and reverence. She was a ghost from a terrifying story, a prophecy made of flesh and blood. To them, she wasn't Alice. She was the omen. Damien was a constant, suffocating presence. Even when he wasn't in the room, she could feel him. A low thrum of energy at the edge of her senses, a phantom awareness that was both infuriating and strangely comforting. He brought her food himself, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he set the tray down. He tried to talk to her, his deep voice soft, explaining the ways of the pack, the laws of their territory. She met his efforts with a wall of silence. She refused to be a willing participant in her own captivity. Her rejection was the only weapon she had, and she wielded it with a cold, desperate precision. Tonight, she had no choice. A formal gathering had been called, a celebration around a towering bonfire that painted the night sky in flickering shades of orange and red. Damien had insisted she attend. "You cannot hide forever, Alice. They need to see you, and you need to see them." So she stood at the edge of the clearing, arms wrapped tightly around herself, a solitary island in a sea of shifting bodies and low, rumbling laughter. Shifters greeted each other with rough embraces and playful nips, their movements fluid and predatory. A wild, untamed energy pulsed in the air, and the part of her that she kept locked down stirred in response, hungry for the heat and the motion. That was when she saw the other one. He was tall, like Damien, but leaner, with a restless grace. His hair was the color of pale ash, and his eyes, a startling shade of ice blue, found her across the dancing flames. He moved through the crowd with a smooth, confident swagger that was completely different from Damien's brooding stillness. "You must be the lost daughter," he said, his voice a silky, charming purr. He stopped in front of her, his nearness a deliberate provocation. "I am Kale, Alpha of the Silver Creek Pack." He took her hand, his touch cool, and brushed his lips against her knuckles. "The stories don't do you justice." Alice stiffened, pulling her hand away. "I don't know what you're talking about." Kyle's smile was sharp and knowing. "Oh, I think you do." His icy gaze flickered over her shoulder for a split second before returning to her. "It's a dangerous game being the Alpha's mate, especially an Alpha with so many enemies." A low growl, like the sound of distant thunder, rumbled through the clearing. It came from Damien. He was standing 20 feet away, talking to one of his senior warriors, but his entire body was rigid with tension. His golden eyes were fixed on Kyle, and they were no longer warm like honey. They were the color of a raging wildfire. The possessive fury in his gaze was so palpable, so raw, that it felt like a physical touch. He took a half step forward, every muscle in his body coiled to spring. The entire clearing seemed to hold its breath. Kyle just chuckled, a low, amused sound. He leaned closer to Alice, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "See? A cage is still a cage, no matter how gilded. Be careful whose protection you trust." He gave her a final, lingering look, and then melted back into the crowd, leaving Alice with a racing heart and the chilling weight of Damien's unrelenting gaze. Chapter 8. A Bond of Silence. The next morning, an old woman approached her. Her name was Alara, and her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes a kind, cloudy gray. Unlike the others, she looked at Alice with something that resembled pity, not fear. She carried a steaming mug in her gnarled hands. "You look troubled, child," Alara said, her voice soft and creaky, like old leather. "The first days are always the hardest. This will help. It's an old remedy. Calms the spirit and helps a new wolf settle." Alice hesitated. She didn't trust anyone here, but the woman's gentle expression seemed genuine. And she was so tired. Tired of the fear, tired of the constant hum of Damien's presence in her mind, tired of the battle raging inside her. A moment of peace was a temptation she couldn't resist. "Thank you," she murmured, accepting the warm ceramic mug. The tea was fragrant and earthy, with a slightly bitter aftertaste. She drank it all. The effect was not immediate. But over the next few hours, a strange and welcome quiet began to settle over her. The constant, low-level anxiety that had been her companion for weeks simply faded. The ever-present thrum of Damien's energy, the invisible thread that connected her to him, grew fainter and fainter until it vanished completely. A profound sense of relief washed over her. It was gone. The phantom limb she'd been wrestling with had been amputated. This, she thought with a surge of vindication, was proof. The bond had never been real. It was just fear, stress, a trick of a traumatized mind. Now there was nothing, just silence. Her newfound peace, however, seemed to have a strange effect on Damien. When he saw her later that day, he stopped dead in the hallway. A deep frown creased his brow. "Alice?" he said, his voice laced with a confusion she didn't understand. She just gave him a cool, distant look and walked past him. As she passed, she saw him physically flinch, his hand rising to his chest as if he'd been struck. A brief, sharp flash of what looked like agony crossed his face. For a moment, she felt a pang of something, concern, guilt, but the silence in her own soul was too complete. She couldn't connect to his pain. She felt nothing. The emotional void was a shield. She felt stronger, more in control than she had in weeks. She could finally think clearly, without the constant, chaotic pull of his emotions interfering with her own. Her resolve hardened. She would find a way out of here. She would get back to her life. This hollow peace was so much better than the storm he brought with him. She clung to the numbness, nurtured it, used it to rebuild the walls around her heart. But that night, the dream came again. It was more vivid, more real than ever before. She was running under a full moon, the forest floor a soft carpet beneath her paws. And he was there, a magnificent black wolf running at her side. She could feel his joy, his strength, his fierce devotion. There was no fear, no anger, no rejection. There was only a perfect, silent harmony. They moved as one, their spirits intertwined. In the dream, she could feel the bond, a radiant, unbreakable cord of light connecting them. She could feel his love, a vast and overwhelming force. She woke with a gasp, her heart aching with a profound sense of loss. The silence in her mind felt different now. It was no longer peaceful. It was empty. Chapter 9. Trial by Fire. Her numbness was seen as a curse. The pack elders, their faces grim and lined with worry, convened a council. They saw her lack of response to their alpha, her cold detachment, as proof that the prophecy was coming true. She was an empty vessel, a broken mate who would bring their leader to ruin. They didn't see her as a victim. They saw her as a weapon aimed at their heart. And so, they demanded a trial, a test. To prove she was not a blight upon their pack, Damien had fought it. Alice had seen the fury in his eyes when he emerged from the council chamber. But the law was the law, and the elders' fear was a powerful current. The trial was set. It wasn't a fight to the death. It was a hunt. 3 of the pack's strongest warriors would pursue her through a predetermined section of their territory. Her task was to reach the ancient, lightning-scarred oak tree at the valley's northern ridge before they caught her. She had a 10-minute head start, a human nurse against 3 supernatural predators. It was a death sentence disguised as a tradition. They led her to the edge of the woods. Fear, cold and sharp, was a knot in her belly, but the emptiness in her soul gave her a strange clarity. The fury was still there, a hot coal buried under the ashes of her emotions. They wanted to see if she was cursed? Fine. She would show them what a cornered, desperate woman could do. As the horn blew to signal the start, she didn't just run. She fled. The first few minutes were blind panic, branches whipping at her face, her lungs burning. But then, something shifted. The instincts she had suppressed for so long began to awaken. The world came alive in a way it never had before. Her nursing knowledge kicked in, an analytical calm layering over her fear. She smeared handfuls of wet, pungent mud over her skin, remembering a documentary about how it could mask scent. She saw the forest not as a terrifying maze, but as a series of opportunities. A shallow creek to hide her tracks, a thicket of thorny bushes to slow her pursuers, a fallen log to crawl under. She could hear them behind her, their confident calls echoing through the trees. They were playing with her. But the longer she evaded them, the less it felt like a game. She moved with a cunning she didn't know she possessed, doubling back on her own trail, using the terrain to her advantage. The sun began to set, casting long, deep shadows that she used as camouflage. She was exhausted, scratched, and bruised. But she was alive. She was surviving. And with every minute that passed, a fierce, exhilarating sense of her own power began to grow. This was what they had tried to beat out of her family. This was what she had tried to kill in herself. This wild, clever, unbreakable instinct to survive. The scarred oak tree appeared through the thinning woods, its bare branches reaching for the sky like skeletal fingers. She could see it. She was going to make it. With a final, desperate burst of adrenaline, she broke from the tree line and sprinted across the open ground toward the oak. One of the warriors, a huge brute named Marcus, burst from the woods to her right, his face contorted in a frustrated snarl. He was going to intercept her. She wouldn't make it. But just as he lunged, she did the last thing he expected. She stopped, dropped low, and spun, kicking out with all her might. Her foot connected with his knee, a weak spot she knew from her anatomy classes. He howled in pain and surprise, his leg buckling. It wouldn't stop him for long, but it was enough. She scrambled the last few feet, and slammed her palm against the rough, sacred bark of the oak tree. Silence. She had won. She stood there, chest heaving, covered in mud and sweat, and faced the warriors as they emerged from the woods. Their expressions were no longer arrogant. They were stunned. The entire pack, who had been watching from the ridge, was silent. Then someone started to clap, then another. Soon, the entire pack was applauding. She had earned their respect. Damien pushed through the crowd, his face a mask of raw, unfiltered emotion. He looked at her not as a problem or a prophecy, but as a miracle. His golden eyes were shining with a fierce, breathtaking pride and an awe that felt more intimate than any touch. He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched. But Alice looked at his face, at the awe and the pride and the love she could see but not feel, and the cold emptiness inside her was all she had left. She turned her back on him and walked away. Chapter 10. A Healer's Touch. The sounds of a fight woke her from a restless sleep. Not the clean, sharp cracks of the trial, but something messier. The sounds of a real battle. Snarls, pained yelps, and the heavy thud of bodies hitting the earth. Alice went to her window and saw them returning from the woods. The pack's warriors were moving with a grim purpose, their forms smudged with dirt and something dark that wasn't mud. They had fought rogues at the border, and they had taken injuries. Her nurse's instincts, the most deeply ingrained part of her, flared to life. Before she could think, she was out of her room and heading for the infirmary. It was organized chaos. Ilara was already there, her old hands moving with practiced skill, stitching a wound on a young warrior's leg. But there were too many injured. Alice saw Damien across the room. He was leaning against a wall, his face pale beneath his tan, his breathing carefully controlled. A long, vicious gash ran down his forearm, a deep, ragged tear that was still sluggishly weeping blood. He was ignoring it, directing his warriors, his voice a low, steady command despite the pain he had to be in. Their eyes met across the room. He gave her a single, sharp shake of his head. Stay away. But for the first time, she ignored him. The sight of an untreated wound was a call to action she couldn't deny. She grabbed a medical kit, her hands moving with a familiar, confident efficiency. She walked straight to him, her gaze clinical, her voice devoid of emotion. Sit down, she ordered, pointing to a nearby stool. That needs to be cleaned and stitched before it gets infected. For a moment, she thought he would refuse. A muscle jumped in his jaw. But then, with a slow, weary sigh, he did as she asked. The other wolves in the room fell silent, watching the strange tableau. The omen, the cursed mate, tending to their injured alpha. Alice ignored them. She focused on the task. She knelt before him, the antiseptic sharp and clean in the air. Her fingers, gentle and professional, probed the edges of the cut. The moment her skin touched his, a jolt went through him. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, and every muscle in his arm went rigid. Stay still, she murmured, her voice soft but firm. She kept her eyes on the wound, refusing to look at his face. But she could feel his gaze on her, a heavy, burning weight. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, filled only with the sound of her own steady breathing and his ragged, suppressed shudders every time her fingers brushed his skin. The air grew warm, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with the man sitting before her. He smelled of sweat, blood, and the deep, earthy scent of pine that was uniquely his. The phantom bond, the one she felt nothing from, was a roaring inferno from his side. She could sense it in the tremors that ran through him, in the way his raw power seemed to bow to her touch. She finished the last stitch, her work neat and precise. As she reached for the bandages, his other hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist. His grip was surprisingly gentle, but it held her in place. Her heart gave a painful lurch. Alice, he whispered, his voice rough with a pain that wasn't from the cut. She finally looked up, His golden eyes were dark, swirling with a desperate, agonizing hunger that stole her breath. He was staring at her mouth. He leaned in, slowly, his control fracturing before her very eyes. His lips were an inch from hers, then a hair's breadth. She could feel the heat of his breath, could see the battle waging in his gaze. He was going to kiss her, and a terrified, traitorous part of her wanted him to. Then, with a shudder that racked his entire body, he pulled back. He released her wrist as if burned, his face a mask of self-loathing. The moment was broken, leaving only a shimmering, unspoken thing hanging in the air between them. Chapter 11. The Breaking Moon. The full moon did not rise quietly. It clawed its way into the sky, a sickly white orb that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The entire pack was on edge, their instincts raw, their tempers short. The air itself felt thin, stretched to a breaking point. Alara had warned her. The moon affects us all, child, but an alpha with a rejected mate, his wolf will be at war with itself. He will be in great pain. Damien had locked himself in the reinforced room in the lodge's cellar, the one built for exactly this purpose. But the thick, iron-banded door couldn't contain the sounds. Alice sat in her room, trying to read, but the sounds from below were impossible to ignore. A low, pained groaning that escalated into a full-throated roar of pure agony. Then came the splintering crash of wood, followed by a furious, desperate snarl. This wasn't just a transformation. This was a battle. Something was terribly wrong. Her medical mind cataloged the sounds, analyzing them, diagnosing them. The sounds were of a body tearing itself apart. Against her better judgment, against every instinct for self-preservation she had, she found herself walking toward the cellar door. She convinced one of the guards to let her look through the small barred window. What she saw made her blood run cold. He was only half-shifted, caught in a monstrous state between man and beast. His body was a twisted landscape of bulging muscle, sprouting fur, and pale human skin. His wolf was fighting for control, but the man was fighting back, and the conflict was destroying him from the inside. His golden eyes were wild with a feverish torment, recognizing nothing. He threw himself against the stone walls, his howls a symphony of pain and confusion. The wolf was in agony because its mate was close but emotionally gone. The rejection, amplified by the power of the moon, was driving it insane. He was going to kill himself. The thought was sharp and certain. He would tear himself to pieces before the night was over. Before she even realized what she was doing, she had the key from the guard. "Let me in." "Luna! No! He'll tear you apart!" But she wasn't the Luna. She was a nurse, and this was a patient in critical distress. She slipped inside, locking the door behind her. The beast turned, its massive head low, a deep rumbling growl starting in its chest. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She stood her ground, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Damien," she said, her voice quiet, calm, the way she would speak to a terrified patient. "It's me. It's Alice. You're safe." She took a slow, deliberate step forward. The wolf snarled, its lips pulling back from terrifyingly long teeth. She kept talking, her voice a steady, soothing murmur. She didn't talk about mates or bonds. She talked about the weather, about a book she was reading, about anything normal. She was using her scent, her calm, her voice to soothe the primal thing in front of her. Slowly, hesitantly, the beast quieted. It sank to the floor, its massive form trembling. It watched her, the torment in its eyes lessening, replaced by a deep, primal confusion and a desperate need. She approached carefully and knelt just out of reach. She was still talking, her voice a lifeline in the storm of his pain. He crawled toward her, no longer a monster but something wounded and seeking comfort. He laid his huge, furry head in her lap, his body racked with shudders. She instinctively stroked his fur, her fingers sinking into the thick, dark coat. A wave of pure, undiluted emotion washed over her, slipping past the herbal block for the first time. His pain, his loneliness, his overwhelming, all-consuming love for her, It flooded her senses, breaking down her walls, shattering her defenses. And in that moment, she wasn't a nurse. He wasn't a patient. The man reemerged from the beast, his skin slick with sweat, his eyes clear and focused on her. He was beautiful and broken, and he was hers. He surged up, his mouth crashing down on hers. It wasn't a kiss of tenderness. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation, of a soul finding its other half in the darkness. She didn't fight it. She surrendered, meeting his primal hunger with a raw, aching need of her own that she had denied for far too long. He brought her to her knees. He fulfilled the prophecy. And as the world dissolved into nothing but touch and heat and sensation, a single terrifying thought screamed through her mind. I've just doomed him. The morning after, sunlight streamed through the high cellar window, painting stripes across their tangled limbs. She lay curled against his side, the unfamiliar weight of his arm draped possessively over her waist. The silence in her soul was gone, replaced by the roaring, terrifying, beautiful hum of the completed bond. Damien stirred, his lips brushing against her temple. His voice was a low, rough whisper against her skin. I'll never regret you. The words, meant to be a comfort, landed like a death sentence. Chapter 12. An Alpha's Gambit. The aftermath was a fragile, terrifying thing. The bond was a living presence inside her now, a constant, vibrant connection to Damien that left her feeling raw and exposed. She could feel the steady beat of his heart even when he was rooms away. She felt a dull echo of his contentment, his relief, his deep, possessive love. And it terrified her. Every gentle touch, every soft look he gave her, felt like another step toward his ruin. She had brought him to his knees, not with a curse, but with a surrender. Was there a difference? She responded to his newfound tenderness with a brittle, wounded silence, trying desperately to rebuild the walls he had so completely shattered. A week after the full moon, a summit was called. The recent rogue attacks were becoming more organized, a threat to all the packs in the region. Kale and his Silver Creek pack were the first to arrive. Alice stood by Damien's side on the Great Hall's dais, playing the part of the Luna as he'd asked. She felt like an imposter in a borrowed dress, the weight of the pack's stares a physical burden. Kale's ice-blue eyes found her immediately. He saw the new, fragile tension between her and Damien, and his smile was that of a wolf scenting a weakness. While the Alphas were engaged in a heated debate about territory lines, Kale made his move. He approached the dais, his voice carrying easily through the tense hall. Alpha Damien, he began, his tone dripping with false respect. A wise leader protects his assets, and I can think of no greater asset than your beautiful mate. He turned his full attention to Alice, his gaze sweeping over her with an infuriating possessiveness. But I have to wonder if she is truly protected here. A low murmur went through the assembled packs. It was a direct, public challenge. Damien's body went rigid, his hand resting on the hilt of a ceremonial knife at his belt. My mate's safety is not your concern, Kale. Damien's voice was dangerously low, a warning. Kale ignored him, speaking only to Alice. This pack is haunted by a prophecy that paints you as a curse. They test you, they doubt you. They watch you, waiting for their alpha to fall. He took a step closer. My pack does not believe in such foolish omens. We believe in strength. We would see you as a queen, not a curse. He held out his hand. Come with me, Alice. I will give you sanctuary, a place where you will be honored, not feared. The offer was a tangible thing, a lifeline, a way out of this impossible situation. If she left, the prophecy couldn't be fulfilled. If she left, Damien would be safe. She could see the appeal in Kale's cool, confident eyes. For a heart-stopping second, she was tempted. She looked at his outstretched hand, then at Damien. The pain and betrayal that flashed in Damien's golden eyes were so profound, so devastating, that it felt like a physical wound in her own chest. That was all it took. Damien's control snapped. He moved faster than she could track, surging off the dais. He didn't touch Kale. He came straight for her. He backed her against the wall, his hands slamming against the stone on either side of her head, caging her in. His face was inches from hers, his eyes blazing with a wild, feral fire that stripped away all traces of the gentleman from the night of the full moon. This was the alpha. This was the predator. He was radiating a possessive fury that silenced the entire hall. The silence was broken by his voice, a low, guttural growl that was not meant for anyone else but her. It was a promise, a threat, and a desperate, soul-deep claim. You're mine. Chapter 13. An Alpha's Fury. Damien's declaration had fractured the summit. Kale had left with a smug, threatening smile, and the other packs had retreated with wary, uncertain glances. The Black Moon pack was a simmering pot of tension, caught between loyalty to their alpha and the chilling fear of the prophecy Kale had so expertly stoked. In the chaos, Alice had become more isolated than ever, a symbol of a coming war. She was in the lodge's library, a quiet, dusty room that had become her only refuge when the attack came. It was silent and fast. A cloth soaked in a sweet, cloying herb was pressed over her mouth and nose. A strong arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her from her feet. There was no shout, no struggle, just a dizzying slide into darkness. She woke up to the smell of damp earth and decay. She was in a dark, crumbling cabin, the kind hunters abandoned decades ago. Her hands were tied behind her back with a rough rope that bit into her skin. The gaunt, hungry-looking rogue from the alley was there, his eyes glowing with a sick triumph. But he wasn't alone this time. Another, a woman with a cruel scar curving down her lip, was sharpening a knife. "She's awake," the man rasped. The scarred woman looked up, her eyes cold and reptilian. "Good. The Sinclair witch blood. Your mother was a slippery one. Always knew her line had power. We'll see what happens when we spill a little of it." Witch blood. The words made no sense, but the glint of the knife was a universal language. Fear, sharp and paralyzing, seized her. But then, the bond roared to life. Through it, she could feel Damien. Not his thoughts, but his emotion. It was a tidal wave of pure, untamed rage. An alpha's fury, a mate's terror. He knew. He was coming. And he was not just angry. He was completely, utterly unhinged. The forest outside exploded. It wasn't the sound of a man running. It was the sound of a force of nature. Trees splintered. The ground shook. The rogues scrambled to their feet, their faces pale with terror. A sound ripped through the night. A howl so full of rage and pain and promise of death that the very walls of the cabin seemed to tremble. It was a sound that should have terrified her, but it filled her with a fierce, soaring hope. The door didn't open. It disintegrated. A massive black wolf, larger than any she had ever imagined, burst through the splintered frame. Its fur was the color of midnight, its muscles coiled with lethal power, and its eyes were two burning suns of golden fury. It was Damien. But it was also something more, something older and more primal. The beast of the full moon was here, but this time, it was not in pain. It was in absolute control. The scarred woman lunged with the knife. The wolf moved like a blur of shadow. Its massive jaws closed around her arm with a sickening crunch of bone. She screamed, a shrill, cut-off sound, as the beast threw her across the room like a rag doll. The gaunt man tried to run. The wolf was on him in 2 bounds, its weight crashing him to the floor. There was a terrible, wet, tearing sound, and then silence. It was a massacre. A brutal, efficient, and utterly terrifying display of power. When it was over, the great wolf stood in the center of the carnage, its chest heaving, its muzzle dark with blood. It turned its head, and those burning golden eyes found her. The rage was still there, a wildfire burning just beneath the surface, but as it looked at her, tied and terrified, the fire banked. A low, pained whine escaped its throat. It took a hesitant step toward her. Alice didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She looked at this terrifying, magnificent creature, this engine of pure destruction, and she wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid for him, for the pain he must have felt, for the rage he had unleashed on her behalf. In the face of the beast, she felt, for the very first time, completely and utterly safe. Chapter 14, A Secret Claim. He shifted back to his human form outside, away from the carnage and her eyes. When he re-entered the ruined cabin, he was just Damien again, though his skin was slick with sweat and his breathing was still ragged. He didn't speak. He went straight to her and with a grim set to his jaw, cut the ropes from her wrists. The moment she was free, she did something that surprised them both. She launched herself into his arms, her hands clinging to the back of his shirt, her face buried against his chest. He stood rigid for a second, shocked, before his arms came around her, crushing her to him in a desperate, trembling embrace. He took her back to their own cabin, the one that had first been her prison and now felt like their sanctuary. He cleaned the scrapes on her wrists with a tenderness that made her throat ache. The silence was different now. It wasn't a weapon or a wall. It was a space filled with unspoken things, with the terror of what they had almost lost. The prophecy, she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. I thought if I left, you would be safe from it, from me. Damien knelt before her, his hands taking hers. His gaze was raw, stripped of all his alpha authority, leaving only the man. Don't you understand, Alice? A life without you isn't safe. It isn't anything. He brought her hand to his lips, his voice dropping to a rough, pleading murmur. I would rather be brought to my knees by your side than rule 1,000 years alone. And that was it. The last of her walls crumbled. The fear of the prophecy, the weight of her family's past, it all seemed small, insignificant, compared to the truth she felt in his touch, in his eyes, in the fierce, unwavering certainty of the bond that connected them. She had been fighting against fate. But what if fate wasn't the enemy? What if fate had brought her home? I'm not running anymore, she said, her voice clear and strong. I choose this. I choose you. A shudder went through him, a wave of pure, overwhelming relief that she felt as if it were her own. He surged to his feet, pulling her up with him. His mouth found hers in a kiss that was nothing like the desperate, primal claiming in the cellar. This was a kiss of reverence, of promises made and accepted. It was a seal on a choice they were both making, to face whatever was coming, together. Then be mine, he growled against her lips, his voice thick with an emotion too powerful for words. Truly, in every way a mate can be. She knew what he was asking. The marking. The final, irrevocable step. A bite that would brand her as his and him as hers for all eternity. It was a permanent, visible claim. A declaration to the world. And she wanted it more than she had ever wanted to be normal. Yes, she breathed. He led her to the bed, his movements filled with a sacred gravity. He lowered her gently onto the soft furs, his eyes never leaving hers. He bent his head, his lips tracing a fiery path along her jawline to the sensitive curve where her neck met her shoulder. A thrill, sharp and sweet, shot through her. This will hurt for a moment, he murmured against her skin. I'm not afraid, she whispered back, and it was the truest thing she had ever said. She arched her neck, giving him access. His canines extended, sharp points of ivory that grazed her skin. He hesitated for a heartbeat, and then he bit down. A sharp, electric pain lanced through her, followed by a wave of pure bliss so intense it made her cry out. It was agony and ecstasy, a fire that burned away every last trace of her old life. She felt the bond inside her snap into its final, deepest configuration, a supernova of light and energy. She felt his soul pour into hers. As he pulled back, a new instinct, fierce and possessive, rose in her. She reached up, tangled her hands in his hair, and pulled his head back down. Before he could react, she sank her own teeth into the muscle of his shoulder, claiming him as he had claimed her. A shocked guttural groan was ripped from his throat. They were one. Lying in the quiet aftermath, their bodies tangled, their souls bound. A fragile peace settled over them. It was shattered by the sound of hushed, urgent voices outside. Damien was instantly alert, shielding her with his body. They were two of his own pack guards. "The council is furious," one voice said. "Valerius is calling for a vote. He says the Alpha's sentiment for the girl is a liability. He's moving to have him stripped of his title tonight." Chapter 15, The Unraveling. They didn't wait for the council to come to them. Dressed in minutes with the fresh, stinging marks on their skin hidden beneath their clothes, they walked with a shared, silent purpose toward the great hall. The bond was a river of strength flowing between them. Alice could feel Damien's cold, controlled fury as if it were her own, and he could feel her steady, unwavering resolve. They were a united front. The doors to the hall swung open, revealing the entire pack council assembled, their faces grim. Valerius, the ancient elder with eyes like chips of granite, sat at the head of the table. "Alpha Damien," Valerius said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "We were just discussing the dire situation you have brought upon this pack. Your attachment to this girl has made you weak. The prophecy is a warning we can no longer ignore." "The only thing I have ignored for too long is the snake hiding in my own council," Damien retorted, his voice dangerously soft. He and Alice stopped at the foot of the table, his hand resting on the small of her back. A simple, possessive gesture that spoke volumes. Valerius's eyes narrowed. "Your tone is treasonous." "Is it?" Damien countered. "Tell me, Valerius, why were the rogues who took my mate so interested in her bloodline? They spoke of a Sinclair with witch blood, a term I have not heard since my father spoke of Lena Sinclair, and the abilities her family was rumored to possess." A flicker of unease went through the other elders. Valerius's composure, however, did not crack. Old stories, the ramblings of savage rogues, the same rogues who have been attacking our borders with increasing organization? Damien pressed on, his voice like steel. "The same attacks you have used to argue that my focus is divided? The truth is, my mate's parents were not exiled for fleeing a prophecy. They were framed by you, because you feared my father's alliance with a powerful bloodline. You wanted Lena Sinclair's power out of the pack, and you used a twisted story to do it." Alice stared at the old man, her heart a block of ice. It was him. He was the reason her parents had been cast out, the reason she had grown up in shame and denial. He had stolen her life. Valerius finally dropped the pretense. A cold, cruel smile touched his lips. "Your father was a sentimental fool. He would have let that woman's unpredictable magic seep into the Alpha line. I did what was necessary to protect the purity of this pack. Just as I am doing now." He stood, his voice rising to address the other elders. "He is compromised. His judgment is clouded by this girl, just as his father's was. He is not fit to lead." As if on cue, the doors of the great hall opened again. Kyle strode in, flanked by his own warriors, his expression smug and triumphant. He was in on it. All of it. The rogue attacks, the political pressure. It was all a coordinated coup. "It seems your council has finally seen the truth, Damien," Kale said, his voice full of mock pity. He looked past Damien, his eyes locking on Alice. "I warned you this would happen." He then turned to the assembled Black Moon Pack members who had gathered, his voice booming with authority. "You see, the prophecy does not lie. She has already brought him to his knees, making him defy his own council, his own law for her. His reign is over." Chapter 16, The Alpha's Sacrifice. The great hall was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Kale's accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Valerius's betrayal had split the pack's loyalty down the middle. Alice could see it in their faces, The wavering uncertainty, the fear. They looked at her, then at Damien, and they saw the prophecy. They saw their doom. She felt Damien's hand tighten on her back, a silent message of reassurance. But when she looked up at him, she saw a chilling, heartbreaking calculation dawning in his eyes. He saw the fracture lines running through his pack, and he saw that she was standing right on top of them. He was going to make a choice, an impossible one. He let go of her. The loss of his touch was a sudden, shocking cold. He took a step away, creating a chasm between them. He turned to face her, and his face. It was a mask of ice. The warmth, the love, the fierce possessiveness were gone, replaced by a look of cold, scathing contempt. It was so sudden, so complete, that it couldn't possibly be real. But it looked real. "You," he said, his voice ringing with a cold fury that silenced the entire hall. "Cale is right. Valerius is right." Each word was a hammer blow. This was a mistake. He looked at her as if she were something vile he had found on the bottom of his shoe. "The elders warned that you were a weakness, a curse upon this pack. I was a fool to think my duty could be swayed by a pretty face and a fated bond that has brought nothing but strife." Alice's breath hitched. A disbelieving laugh almost escaped her. This was a trick, a strategy. It had to be. But the bond. The beautiful, vibrant river of light that now connected them. It suddenly felt like it was freezing over. A searing, physical pain began to radiate from the new mark on her neck, a pain so intense it made her gasp. "I was wrong," Damien continued, his voice merciless. He looked at Valerius, then at the rest of the pack, his voice booming with the formal authority of an alpha making a decree. "The prophecy is a warning I will no longer ignore. This bond is a poison, and I am cutting it out." He turned his burning gaze back on her. "I, Damien Blackwood, Alpha of the Black Moon Pack, reject you, Alice Sinclair. I sever this bond. You are nothing to me. You are hereby exiled, a rogue with no claim and no protection. You are not welcome on these lands. Now get out." The world shattered. The pain from the mark exploded, a white-hot agony that felt like her soul was being ripped from her body. It wasn't just emotional heartbreak, it was a physical tearing. The hum of his presence in her mind screamed into a piercing shriek of static, and then silence. A dead, horrifying void. The emptiness she had felt before was a pale shadow compared to this. This was an amputation without anesthetic. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her neck, a choked, wounded sound escaping her lips. She saw the triumphant smirk on Kyle's face. She saw the cold satisfaction in Valerius's eyes, and she saw the looks of pity and scorn from the pack wolves who had, just a day before, applauded her. Humiliation, hot and suffocating, washed over her. There was nothing left to do, nothing left to say. She turned and fled. She ran from the hall, from the pack, from the man who had just torn her world apart, the unbearable agony of a broken bond chasing her into the darkness. Chapter 17. The Twisted Prophecy. The forest was a nightmare of grasping branches and deep swallowing shadows. Alice ran without seeing, propelled by a pain so immense it had consumed all other thought. Each step was a fresh wave of agony. The broken bond was a raw, open wound inside her, a gaping hole where Damien's presence used to be. It hurt to breathe. It hurt to think. It hurt to exist. The physical world seemed to fade, replaced by the all-consuming reality of her internal torment. She finally collapsed at the base of a towering pine, her body racked with shuddering sobs that were silent, because she didn't have the air to make a sound. This was her fault. All of it. The thought took root in the fertile ground of her despair. Valerius was right. Cale was right. Damien's brutal rejection was the kindest thing he could have done. He was trying to save his pack from her. He was trying to save himself. The prophecy wasn't a warning, it was a fact. Her bond shall bring the Alpha to his knees. She had done that. In the cellar, on the night of the full moon, she had surrendered, and in doing so, had sealed his fate, his power undone by her heart's decree. Her heart had chosen him, and that choice was unraveling his entire world. She was the curse. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't a matter of good or bad intentions. It was in her blood. The witch blood the rogues had spoken of. The unstable magic her family carried. It made her toxic. Her love was a poison. Her very presence was a catalyst for destruction. She looked at her hands, half expecting to see them dripping with blood. The pain inside her was so great, so absolute, that it became a certainty. The only way to save him, the only way to undo the damage she had caused, was to disappear. To run so far that the bond, broken as it was, would fade completely. To erase herself from his life, from his world. It was the only act of love she had left to give, the ultimate sacrifice. A twig snapped behind her. She scrambled to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure emerged from the moon-dappled shadows. It was Damien. His face was grim, and a fresh, bloody gash ran from his temple to his jaw. The fighting had already started. He looked exhausted, his powerful shoulders slumped with a weariness that went beyond the physical, but his eyes, when his eyes found hers, they were filled with a desperate, frantic relief. "Alice," he breathed, his voice breaking on her name. He took a step toward her. She flinched back, holding up a hand. "No! Stay away from me! Haven't I done enough?" "That wasn't real," he said, his voice a raw plea. "Everything I said in there, it was a lie. I had to get you out. I had to make them think you were worthless to me so they would leave you alone, so you would be safe." Tears streamed down her face. "Safe? Damien, don't you see? There is no safe. Not as long as I'm alive. I'm the one who is destroying you." He shook his head, taking another step, ignoring her protest. He reached for her, his hand trembling. "That's not true. None of it is." He was so close now, the familiar scent of pine and wildness a torment to her shattered senses. He looked into her eyes, and the alpha, the warrior, the strategist were all gone. There was only the mate, broken and bleeding and desperate. His voice was a ragged whisper, the same word he had breathed the first time he had saved her. "Mine." Chapter 18. A Pack Divided. Before she could answer, the woods around them erupted. It wasn't the chaotic attack of disorganized rogues. This was a coordinated military assault. Wolves, some bearing the silver fur of Kale's pack, others the familiar dark coats of the Black Moon traders poured from the trees. They moved with a chilling efficiency, their goal clear, to eliminate their alpha while he was alone and distracted. Damien reacted instantly, shoving Alice behind him, his body becoming a human shield. He met the first attacker with a brutal, bone-jarring blow, his transformation beginning, his hands already tipped with black claws. But they were too many. For every one he took down, two more took its place. The fight was a whirlwind of snarling teeth and flashing claws. Damien was a force of nature, a terrifying specter of an alpha fighting for his territory and his mate. But he was bleeding, he was tired, and his focus was divided. Every few seconds his gaze would flash to her, making sure she was still safe, and every one of those moments was an opening for his enemies. Alice could only watch in horror, her nursing instinct screaming at the sheer brutality of it all. This was her fault. This battle, these wolves turning on their own alpha, it was all because of her. The prophecy was playing out in blood and violence right before her eyes. One of Valerius's lieutenants, a big wolf she recognized as Marcus, the same one she had outsmarted in the trial, saw his chance. While Damien was occupied with two of Kale's warriors, Marcus lunged, not at Damien, but at her. Damien roared, a sound of pure primal fury. He threw his current opponent aside and spun, launching himself in front of Alice. He intercepted Marcus in midair, but he was off balance, exposed. As they crashed to the ground, another of Kale's wolves raked its claws down Damien's back, deep and vicious. Damien cried out, a sound of pure agony that tore through Alice's soul. He slumped, his movements suddenly sluggish. The tide had turned. He was gravely injured. He struggled to his feet, swaying, a dozen smaller wounds now covering his body. But the gash on his back was the worst. Blood was pouring from it, staining his dark shirt black. He was weakening, fast. He managed to throw one more traitor aside, but his strength was failing. The circle of enemies tightened around them, their expressions triumphant. It was over. Alice rushed to his side, her hands trying uselessly to staunch the bleeding from his back. He was dying, at her feet, just as she had always feared. Despair, absolute and crushing, washed over her. Fate was not a choice. It was a prison, and the walls were closing in. Damien leaned his weight against her, his breathing shallow and wet. He looked at her, and even through the haze of pain, his golden eyes were clear, focused only on her. There was no blame, no regret. Only a love so profound it defied the prophecy, defied the politics, defied even death itself. He lifted a trembling hand, his bloodied fingers brushing her cheek. His voice was a faint, ragged whisper, a final vow breathed into the cold night air. "If I die," he gasped, his gaze holding hers. "I die yours." Chapter 19. The Spark of Defiance. "If I die yours." The words were a whisper, a final breath against the backdrop of snarling and the clash of bodies. But in the shattered silence of Alice's soul, they were a thunderclap. Despair had been a cold, heavy blanket suffocating her. This was a spark, a single, defiant ember in the darkness. She looked down at Damien's pale, blood-streaked face, at the unwavering love in his eyes, and the prophecy's words twisted into a new shape in her mind. Her bond shall bring the Alpha to his knees. Everyone had assumed it meant ruin, destruction, a fall from power. She herself had believed it, had been terrified of it. But what if they were all wrong? What if the words were not a curse but a promise? A man like Damien would never kneel in defeat, but he would kneel for love. He would kneel in devotion. He had knelt for her in the infirmary, had been brought to his knees by his need for her in the cellar. His love for her didn't make him weak. It was the truest, most powerful thing about him, and she had been trying to destroy it. The despair didn't just fade. It was incinerated, burned away by a clean, righteous fury that was hotter than any pain. A rage at Valerius for his lies, a fury at Cale for his greed, and a deep, burning anger at herself for ever believing she was a curse. She was not a blight. She was not a weakness. She was the mate of this man, this Alpha, who was bleeding out at her feet, and she would not let him die. She looked up at the circle of wolves closing in, their teeth bared, their eyes glowing with traitorous hunger. They saw her as a broken toy, the Alpha's foolish mistake. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She laid a gentle, protective hand on Damien's chest, a silent vow passing between them through the bond. Then she stood to her full height. The part of her that was wolf, the part she had starved and hated and feared, rose up to meet her fury. It was not a monster. It was her strength, her heritage, her power. She tilted her head back, the moonlight catching in her tear-filled eyes, and she opened her mouth. The sound that came out was not a human scream. It was a howl. It was not the howl of a victim or of a grieving mate. It was a clear, ringing, resonant cry of pure, defiant challenge. It was the sound of a queen claiming her territory. It sliced through the sounds of the forest, a declaration of war that promised retribution. The attacking wolves froze, their snarls dying in their throats, shocked into stillness by the sheer, unexpected authority in the sound. And the forest answered. From the deep woods, other howls responded. Not the rough, guttural sounds of Cale's mutts or Valerius's traitors. These were the deep, loyal, resonant calls of the Black Moon Pack. They were Damien's wolves, the ones who had not been swayed, who had been scattered in the initial chaos. And they were coming, drawn by the howl of their Luna. Shapes began to emerge from the trees, dark and powerful, their eyes glowing with a fierce loyalty. They weren't just warriors, they were hope. Chapter 20. Forging a Rebellion. The tide of the battle turned in an instant. The arrival of Damien's loyalists, a dozen of his most seasoned warriors led by a grizzled veteran named Gideon, threw the attackers into chaos. They fought with the ferocity of wolves defending their own, and Cale's and Valerius's forces, unprepared for a real resistance, broke and scattered back into the darkness. "Luna," Gideon said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. He looked from her to the fallen form of his alpha, his face grim. "We heard your call." "He's alive," Alice said, her voice sharp with a command she didn't know she possessed. "But he's losing too much blood. We need to move him. Now. Is there somewhere safe?" Gideon nodded. "The old dens. In the heart of the ridge. They won't find us there." They worked together, a small, desperate band of rebels. They fashioned a makeshift stretcher and carried Damien through the treacherous moonlit woods. The cave was small and defensible, hidden behind a curtain of tangled vines. Inside, Alice's training took over completely. She was no longer the lost daughter or the fated mate. She was a healer. She sent the warriors out for specific herbs she recognized from Alara's lessons. Yarrow to stop the bleeding, willow bark for the pain. She tore strips from her own clothes to create clean bandages. Her hands were steady, her mind clear. She was holding the life of their alpha, of her mate, in her hands, and she would not falter. As she worked to stabilize him, she spoke. Her voice was low, but it filled the small cave with a fierce, undeniable power. She told them everything. About her parents, about the witch blood that Valerius feared, about how the old elder had twisted the prophecy to orchestrate this entire coup. She laid the truth bare, a stark and ugly thing. "Valerius told you I was a curse," she said, looking at the faces of the warriors gathered around the firelight. "He was wrong. My bond with your alpha is not his weakness. It is his strength, and it is ours. Valerius and Cale have underestimated us. They underestimated him, and they underestimated me." She tied off the last bandage around Damien's torso, her movements sure and certain. "They started this war based on a lie. We are going to end it with the truth." Gideon looked at her, his old weary eyes filled with a new dawning respect. "What is your command, Luna?" A plan, bold and desperate, had already formed in her mind. "We can't win a war of attrition. We are outnumbered. Our only chance is to strike at the head of the snake." She looked at each of them in turn, her gaze unflinching. "We will challenge them, not in the forest, not in the shadows. We will do it in the arena of law, a sacred challenge for the alpha title in front of the entire pack. Even Valerius cannot deny a challenge issued in the sacred space. We will force them to answer for their treason in the light of day." It was a suicidal plan, but it was their only chance. A grim determination settled over the small group. As if on cue, a new sound drifted on the wind from the direction of the pack lodge. It was the deep, rhythmic beat of war drums. Thump, 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 thump. A slow, ominous heartbeat signaling that Valerius was consolidating his power, calling the pack to recognize a new order. Time was running out. Chapter 21. The Eve of War. The war drums were a call to arms, and the pack fractured along the lines of loyalty and fear. The forest, which had been their sanctuary, became a battlefield. Valerius's faction, bolstered by Cale's warriors, began a systematic purge, hunting down anyone who had not immediately sworn fealty. The night ignited with the sounds of battle, the howls of the hunted and the hunters echoing through the valleys. Alice and her small band of rebels could not stay hidden. They had to move, to fight, to create the chaos they needed to make their way to the arena. And in the midst of it all, Alice changed. The fear that had been her constant companion was gone, burned away by the fire of her purpose. She moved through the woods with a deadly grace, her senses sharper than they had ever been. For the first time, she didn't just feel the wolf within her. She embraced it. She called on its strength. She felt the shift begin, not as a painful, uncontrolled transformation, but as a willing acceptance of power. Her nails thickened and sharpened, elongating into wicked claws. A surge of strength flooded her limbs, making her faster, more agile. She wasn't a full wolf, but she was no longer just a human nurse. She was something more. Something new. She fought alongside Gideon's warriors, a whirlwind of calculated fury. She didn't have their brute strength, but she had a cunning they lacked. She used the forest as her weapon, setting traps, creating diversions, her mind working with a clarity that was both exhilarating and terrifying. She was fighting to protect her mate, to reclaim her home, to rewrite her own destiny. Their plan was to draw the main force of Valerius's traitors toward the eastern border, a feint that would leave the path to the centrally located arena clear. And it was working. The traitors took the bait, their howls of pursuit growing more distant as Gideon led them on a wild chase. The path was almost clear. Victory, a desperate, fragile thing, seemed within their grasp. But they had all underestimated Kale. The Silver Creek Alpha was not a brute who could be baited by the thrill of a chase. He was a predator who knew to go for the throat. As Alice and a few remaining warriors prepared to move the still unconscious Damien from the cave, a chilling howl cut through the night, far too close. Kale had ignored the diversion. He had used the chaos to pinpoint their location. He had come for the wounded king. They burst from the woods, a dozen of Kale's elite guard with Valerius at their head. Alice's small force was overwhelmed in seconds. She fought with a ferocity that shocked them, her claws tearing at anyone who tried to get near Damien. But she was just one. 2 of Kale's wolves pinned her, their weight crushing her to the ground. She could only watch in horror as Kale and Valerius strode into the cave. They emerged moments later, dragging the barely conscious form of Damien between them. He was a trophy, his head lolling, his feet dragging uselessly on the ground, leaving a dark trail of his own blood on the fallen leaves. Kale looked down at the struggling, snarling Alice, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face. "Thank you for the invitation, Luna," he purred, his voice dripping with venom. "It seems we'll be having our challenge in the arena after all, just not the way you planned." He gave a signal, and his warriors began to drag Damien away, heading directly for the sacred circle where their desperate gambit had just become the stage for a public execution. Chapter 22. An Alpha's Ascent. The arena of law was a scar on the earth, a natural amphitheater of gray stone carved into the mountainside by some ancient, forgotten power. Here, under the cold, impartial gaze of the moon, pack law was absolute. The entire Black Moon pack was gathered, a tense, silent sea of bodies, their faces a mixture of fear, confusion, and grim anticipation. In the center, chained to a great stone monolith, was Damien. He was on his knees, not in submission, but because he was too weak to stand. Blood matted his dark hair and stained the dirt around him, but his head was unbowed, his golden eyes burning with a defiant fire. Valerius stood before him, his voice echoing in the stone circle. "For too long we have been led by a heart in chains, blinded by a cursed bond. Tonight we cleanse our pack. We cut out the poison as our Alpha himself once commanded." Kyle stood beside him, a cruel, satisfied smirk on his face, his warriors forming a ring around the monolith. He was the executioner. Alice was being held at the edge of the arena by 2 of Kale's largest brutes. The bond, raw and screaming, flooded her with Damien's pain, his rage, and a deep, unwavering current of love that was aimed only at her. He was dying, and his last thoughts were of her. That knowledge was not a comfort. It was a catalyst. The fury that had sparked in the forest now erupted into a full-blown inferno. The prophecy was never about his weakness. It was about her strength. She was not the curse. She was the cure. A growl ripped from her throat, a sound so inhumanly savage that the wolves holding her flinched. "Let me go," she snarled. They tightened their grip. It was the last mistake they would ever make. Power, raw and primal, exploded from the deepest core of her being. It was not a fight. It was a release, a homecoming. Her bones shifted and reformed with a series of sharp, clean cracks. Pain was a distant thought, burned away by the sheer, exhilarating ecstasy of becoming. Fur, the color of newly minted silver, sprouted from her skin. Her senses exploded outward. She could smell the fear on the traitors, see the frantic pulse in Cale's throat, hear the steady, weakening beat of Damien's heart. She was no longer Alice, the nurse. She was the wolf. She was not a hulking brute like Damien's wolf. She was smaller, leaner, built for speed and grace, a living blade of silver and fury. She burst from the guard's hold, a blur of motion they never saw coming. Kyle, seeing the threat, shifted to meet her, his own gray wolf form large and powerful. But he was a brawler. She was a hunter. He lunged, and she was simply not there. She ducked under his snapping jaws, her own claws tearing a deep gash in his flank. He roared in pain and surprise. He was strong, but she was faster, smarter. She used his own momentum against him, dodging and weaving, her attacks precise and debilitating. She was the clever survivor from the trial, now armed with the teeth and claws of a true wolf. She drove him back, away from Damien, her silver form a stark contrast to his drab gray. In a final, decisive move, she feinted left, and as he overcommitted, she lunged for his throat. She didn't kill him. She pinned him, her jaws clamped just tight enough to prove she could end him at any moment. She held him there, her silver eyes blazing a challenge at every traitor in the arena. Then she released him. The defeated Alpha whimpered and scrambled away, a broken thing. Alice shifted back, the transformation a smooth, controlled ripple of power. She walked to Damien, her body radiating an authority no one dared to question. She knelt before him, placing a hand on his cheek. "It's over," she whispered. He looked up at her, his eyes full of a love and awe so profound it made her heart ache. She looked at Valerius, her gaze like ice. "The prophecy was true," she declared, her voice ringing through the arena. "He is on his knees." She bent her head, and in front of the entire pack she sank her teeth into the scarred, half-healed mark on his neck. It was not a bite of passion, but of power, a healing, a reclaiming. As she bit down, a wave of energy, of pure life force, poured from her into him. He gasped, his body arching, his wounds beginning to seal. The bond between them flared into a blinding sun. She had brought him to his knees, not to destroy him, but to raise him up, stronger than before. As she pulled back, Damien rose to his feet, his strength returning. And one by one, starting with Gideon, the loyal wolves of the Black Moon Pack dropped to one knee, not for their Alpha, but for their Luna. Chapter 23. The Reckoning. The aftermath of the battle was a heavy, ringing silence. The pack, now kneeling as one before Alice and Damien, had borne witness to the birth of a legend. The prophecy had been fulfilled, not as a curse of destruction, but as a testament to a love so powerful it could rewrite fate itself. Valerius stood alone, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. His power, built on a foundation of lies and fear, had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. Gideon and the Loyalists surrounded him, their expressions hard as stone. There was no fight left in the old wolf. His treason was laid bare for all to see. Cale, his wolf form still whimpering, was dragged forward. He shifted back to a man, naked and bleeding, his arrogance replaced by a sniveling terror. Damien, his strength returning with every beat of his heart, stepped forward. His voice, now resonating with the combined power of his own will and Alice's, was the embodiment of final judgment. "You have threatened my mate. You have conspired against my pack. You have broken sacred law. You are no longer welcome in these lands. Be gone by sunrise. If your shadow ever falls on Black Moon territory again, it will be the last thing you ever see." It was a sentence worse than death. A lone wolf, an alpha without a pack, would not survive long. The traitors who had followed Valerius dropped their heads in shame, awaiting their own sentences, But it was Alice who spoke, her voice clear and steady, carrying a healer's compassion rather than a ruler's wrath. "You were led astray by lies and fear," she said, her gaze sweeping over them. "Blood has been spilled. Our pack is broken. There has been enough pain." She looked at Damien, a silent communication passing between them. He nodded his assent. "There will be penance," she continued, "but there will also be healing. We rebuild. Together." It was an act of mercy that solidified her status more than any act of vengeance could have. She was not just a warrior. She was a true Luna. Later, as the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, they stood alone on the ridge overlooking their valley. The sounds of the wounded being tended to drifted up from the lodge below. The cost of the night had been high. The pack was scarred, fractured, but it had survived. Alice leaned her head against Damien's shoulder, the ache in her bones a dull, satisfied thrum. His arm was a solid, comforting weight around her. The marks on their necks were a testament to their victory, a visible symbol of a bond that had been tested by fire and found to be unbreakable. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He looked down at her, his golden eyes soft in the morning light. "For what? For saving my life? For saving our pack?" "Forever doubting," she said simply. He tightened his hold on her, his lips brushing against her hair. "There is nothing to forgive." He tilted her chin up, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. "My fierce, silver-eyed wolf," he murmured, a deep love and pride in his voice. "My Luna." The words were not just a title. They were a promise, a beginning. The road ahead would be long. The healing would take time. But as they stood together, watching the sun rise on their new world, they knew they would face it as one. Chapter 24. A New Dawn. 6 months later, the valley was green and vibrant, healed by the gentle hand of spring. The scars on the pack remained, but they were no longer raw, open wounds. They were reminders of what they had survived. Under the joint leadership of their Alpha and Luna, the Black Moon Pack was not just rebuilding, it was thriving. Valerius was imprisoned for his treason, a living reminder of the danger of ambition. The pack had grown stronger, their loyalty forged in the fires of civil war, now centered on the undeniable truth of the bond between their leaders. Alice had finally come home. She had embraced her role, her unique heritage not a curse to be hidden, but a gift to be shared. The witch blood that Valerius had feared manifested not as dark magic, but as an uncanny empathy, an ability to soothe the pack's anxieties and a deep, instinctual connection to the health of their land and their people. She was their healer in more ways than one. She still worked in the infirmary, her nurse's training now supplemented with Alara's ancient herbal knowledge, but she was also a warrior, a strategist, and a leader. She stood now on the porch of the Alpha's cabin, which was finally starting to feel like her own, watching Damien spar with the younger wolves in the training yard below. He moved with a confidence and joy she had never seen in him before. The brooding, haunted guardian was gone, replaced by a strong, beloved leader. He laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that sent a thrill through her, and his golden eyes found hers across the yard. The love and devotion in his gaze were a constant, steady flame that warmed her to her very soul. He had been brought to his knees, and from that vulnerability, he had risen as a greater Alpha than he had ever been before. Her transformation was complete. She was no longer the timid, broken girl who denied her own nature. She was Alice Sinclair Blackwood, a wolf, a healer, a Luna, the mate of the most powerful Alpha in the region. She was home. Life was not quiet or simple, as she had once so desperately craved. It was loud and messy and filled with a fierce, beautiful, all-consuming love. And it was perfect. As the sun set, painting the mountain peaks in fiery strokes of orange and gold, Alice and Damien walked the northern border, their hands intertwined. A comfortable, happy silence rested between them. But as they crested the final ridge, A strange, unnatural chill snaked down Alice's spine. Her sharpened senses reached out, casting for a threat she couldn't see. Far away, on the jagged peak of a distant, unnamed mountain range well beyond their borders, a lone figure stood, cloaked in shadow. It had felt the surge of power months ago, the reforging of a broken bond, the awakening of an ancient bloodline. It had been watching, waiting. The rogues had only been a symptom. The real threat, an enemy far older and more patient than any pack squabble, had finally taken notice of the lost daughter's return. The war for the pack was over. But the battle for her world had just begun.